All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening to the Transition Board and to members of the public. Thank you all so much for joining us for the Baltimore Children Youth Fund, Inc.'s review of our plans for FY22 and the financial plan. Today is June 23rd, 2021, and it is 6:06 p.m. and this meeting is being called to order. My name is Dion Cartwright. I am the BCYF Transition Board Chair. BCYF is a nonprofit organization stewarding public funds who work to create new opportunities for Baltimore's young people to learn, thrive, and succeed. Today, we will spend some time giving you an overview of BCYF's purpose, our goals as a community resource, and we'll provide an overview of our budget, programming, hiring, recruitment, and infrastructure planning for the new fiscal year. Following our update and review, we will welcome public comments and questions. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. I'd first like to introduce Adam and Adam Jackson, who will share a bit about the protocols for this evening. Adam.
Thank you, Dion. Peace and blessings, everybody. My name is Adam Jackson, and I am the communications lead for the Baltimore Children Youth Fund. Sorry for all the light in my face. The sun decided to literally be in my eyeballs right now. So excuse the sunlight. But thank you for being here this beautiful, beautiful Wednesday evening. So I'm going to just lay down some ground rules, some housekeeping for public comment. So what we're going to have is a presentation by the board, like Dion mentioned, on the financial plan for the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. There'll be several speakers tonight. A lot of members of the board are just going to be laying out their plans, our plans for the organization for the upcoming year. And so after their presentation, there'll be time set aside for public comment and questions. And so just a couple of things. So the chat function, if you used Zoom before, you've used Zoom, you use the chat function. So you can, feel free to give as much feedback in the chat box as much as you like. This is being recorded, so everything you write in the chat box, we'll have access to later. So if there's some comment or feedback that you'd like us to see later that maybe you don't want to speak, you can feel free to use the chat box for that. In addition to that, we have two other ways for you to give feedback and also to ask questions. The first way that you can give feedback is, of course, by speaking it to us directly. And so if you notice at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom window, you'll see the raise hand function. So towards the end, and this will be mentioned, like it'll be towards the end of the actual presentation. That's the time you'll have to actually raise your hand, and then we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly to members of BCYF. We are giving every person a maximum of 3 minutes to speak, which means if you have a question, that's fine. If you just want to give comment, that's fine. It's being recorded, so we do care about your feedback. So you can raise your hand and you can speak, and then we'll unmute you, and then a member of our team will give you a response here live. If you don't want to get on camera, or you don't want to get on the microphone rather, you can also use the Q&A function. So if you notice at the bottom of your screen, you have Q&A, you click that button, you can type a question into the box, and that helps us keep track of the questions that you may have throughout the evening. We want to be reasonable and respectful of everyone's time. So if you have several questions, that's okay, but understand that we may not get to all of your questions tonight. And if you have things you want us to follow up with you on specifically, feel free to reach out to us at info@bcyfund.org. So again, we want to make sure we give people as much space and opportunity to ask questions and give feedback. So feel free to type it in the chat box. Use the Q&A function to ask questions. But if you actually want to give public testimony, you want to give feedback in public and talk on your microphone, just raise your hand in the Q&A section of tonight's program. I'll make sure that we unmute you and you can speak. So, and it's not super duper strict, but we do want to make sure we're respectful of folks' time tonight, because we know that a lot of y'all want to get out and enjoy this beautiful sunny weather. All right. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the nice discussion. Dion.
Thank you so much, Adam. I appreciate that. And we'll reiterate those instructions again right before we kick off the Q&A portion. I'd now like to introduce Erica Seth Davies and Julia Baez, who are going to share a bit about BCYF's purpose.
Hello, good evening, and I apologize, my dog has decided now's the time to bark, so she's joining the board meeting with us. But Eric and I are excited just to help provide some background context on the purpose for BCYF and why BCYF is such a critical entity in Baltimore City. And so for context, for those of you that are joining tonight, the Baltimore Children Youth Fund was created to focus both on the expansion of youth programming as well as the ecosystem that supports young people, and specifically how we as a city better invest in and support leaders of color who are working at the grassroots level to support the dreams, visions, hopes, and all of the great things that young people in Baltimore are seeking. And so what you'll hear tonight as we go through the conversation around the vision for the next fiscal year and the work moving forward is really a blend of that approach, of really thinking about how we both meet the immediate needs of young people and communities, but how we keep an eye on the long-term needs of our city to be able to best respond to what young people are asking for, and how we actually deepen the investment in organizations and leaders of color. Eric and I both have an opportunity to sort of look at what's happening with investment at a local and national level. Locally, what we know in Baltimore is that leaders of color are not invested in at the same rate as their peers, disproportionately at great amounts in terms of the differences between being funded. We also know that when leaders of color are funded in traditional philanthropic spaces, they are often funded at very low amounts that don't allow for the flexibility to build capacity, to scale, and to grow their organization. And so that historical disinvestment in leaders of color and in communities of color in Baltimore has not allowed the youth-serving ecosystem to really grow and structure itself in a way that is responsive to community. And so that is what BCYF intends to do, in addition to the work around our grant making. And I'll turn it over to Erica to add a few points to that as well.
Sure. Thank you, Julia. And thank you all for being here this evening. So I would just suggest that the tension that just exists in doing this work, as Julia described, is that there are just constantly emergent needs that have to be addressed. And so that puts a pressure on BCYF to respond to those needs with dollars. But we view our work not just as transactional. We're not simply an ATM operating in Baltimore City, but we view our work as being transformational. And so in addition to meeting those needs, it's also being able to take a step back and look at that broader ecosystem to understand, quite frankly, how we got here, and making sure that our work, if moved too quickly, isn't exacerbating, reinforcing, or perpetuating some of the harm or the approaches to grant making that have served to marginalize Black leadership in nonprofits, as well as youth serving organizations and grassroots organizations. And so to do that, we have to very often take a both and approach to this work. And it may at times be slower than what folks would like, but if we move too quickly, the default will bring us back to what's been going on in Baltimore for quite some time, and again, marginalizing Black-led nonprofit organizations in the city. And so to ensure that we don't do that, we are taking a very deliberate ecosystem approach. So not just looking at the organizations that are receiving funding themselves, but also the infrastructure for nonprofits in Baltimore City to ensure that folks who are starting amazing work can do that work, that they can spend their energy, their time, their attention, and the resources that do come to them from BCYF, that they can spend that on young people, and they can spend that building programming that meets the needs of youth in Baltimore, that they don't have to spend all of their time worrying about tracking every receipt and putting their own systems in place, accounting systems or evaluation systems in place, that we're also thinking about the infrastructure and the ways that we can support and help build that, strengthen that, specifically for grassroots organizations in Baltimore City. And so again, when we talk about this work being transformational, intentional. It is, again, thinking very intentionally and moving intentionally in those ways so that we are centering youth, we are centering Black youth, and that we are doing the things that are necessary to make sure we're building a system that can work for them.
Thank you so much, Erica and Julia. Thank you for your continued work. We'll now hear from Mr. John Morris and Kirsten Allen about what it means for BCYF to be a community resource.
Hello all, good evening to the Transition Board and community. Thank you for joining us. Mr. John and I are going to use our time to speak about this organization, this institution being an actual community resource. And it is not to slight movements or efforts that have gone on previous to us, but as we move forward, we take those learnings and try to really make sure we are communicating and shifting the narrative to what we in community think is important for youth and young adult investment. As Erica stated, our organization has been really intentional since its inception of just being an organization that isn't based on transactional relationships, but really transforming how we communicate with community, how we engage with young people, and how we support the organizations that are supporting young people and families. That is of utmost importance to us, and we feel like it will lead to actual long-term change where we won't have to be so responsive to the immediate and short-term needs, that those processes and systems will be in place, that long-term impact can actually happen. And that is at the helm, one of the focus areas that are at the helm of BCYF. Our investment approach has been of utmost importance as well, focusing on grassroots organizations, the infrastructure to support those organizations, and just the ecosystem and systems change that needs to happen in order to respond to the actual needs of organizations, which include what the ecosystem is facing now with challenges around fiscal agency and how that disproportionately affects Black-led organizations. So our investment approach, like I said, is very important and has been a long-standing point of strategic focus for this board and those supporting this organization. Mr. John?
One of the things that Erica mentioned, the term she mentioned, is a kind of point of departure for us in our thinking about our role. She said that the idea that takes the greatest opportunity that's presented by the decision of the council to create this fund is that our best role is not necessarily to be an ATM for just an ATM for people, but the term that was coined was a community resource, which is what we're going to talk about. So I think in thinking about some of the things you've heard up to this point, I think we need to understand that what we're talking about supporting is something that's been happening all the time. That in this community, hundreds, maybe thousands of people and organizations see a problem and are moved to take action. There's a missing piece that is a kind of blind spot in our not-for-profit community or the support structure it gives. Our role is to try to begin to build that support structure so those efforts aren't just isolated, but they can be scaled, they can talk to one another, and we can begin seeing it and seeing the power and the efficacy of community action. So taking action for young people that's proximate to it, to them, is important and vital and indispensable, because the one thing that comes out of that action is the lesson learned that young people can master their own environment because they see the adults, the community around them do the same. That is something not the best run or the best not-for-profit can accomplish. It cannot be both the intervener and the parent or the neighbor or the friend. These grassroots organizations can be that, and our best contribution is to enable them to scale the impact of their efforts, to help them make their efforts sustainable so that they can continue, and to enable them to uplift all of those around them. And this is not something that the conventional not-for-profit community has been good at. It takes a number of things to be a community resource. You must see the asset that community can be. You must know what community can do, how it works, and to take action in ways that optimizes community action. That's been a focus of ours, a job that I think has asked people who've been in the not-for-profit community to use the lessons that they learned, and some of the people in the community to use the lessons they learned and to apply them with the added benefit of a financial contribution, and with that contribution to begin establishing a place where this organization can be a voice for those struggling and striving grassroots organizations that can be heard in ways those individual organizations cannot. So part of this meeting is to begin refining that voice so those organizations can flourish, and that those young people that those organizations are proximate to can thrive. So that's our role as a community resource, and we've been trying to refine what that looks like, and in many ways, creating an organization that functions as a community resource. In many ways, like, I guess suppose like jazz, our community has kind of improvised that resource role in a variety of people, in churches, in fraternal organizations. We're trying to do it in a formal organization that has a sustainable tide of funding. In many ways, we are inventing new practices. We are reviewing old practices and trying to adapt them. So as a community resource, our assessment is how well those grassroots organizations are doing to enable young people to prosper and thrive.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. John. It's so critical to the work of BCYF. And thank you, Kirsten Allen, as well. We will now have Kara Ritter, our transition manager, speak about the BCYF planning for the new fiscal year. Kara.
Thank you, Dion. In a moment, I'm going to share my screen. And really what we're talking about are two specific categories: our institutional formation and then also our programming. Okay, so BCYF, the year ahead. And so first we had phases 1 and 2. We're then moving into phase 3. Phases 1 and 2 date back to 2016 with really the passage of the ordinance that created the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund, the citywide task force that made recommendations about the fund's governance and operations and really what it should look like, that there was no current institution that could meet the need of serving grassroots organizations through a racial equity lens. A recommendation was made that Associated Black Charities was the one intermediary at the time that could serve in this function temporarily, and then a permanent independent institution would need to be developed. In 2018 was the first year of grant awards. In 2019, it was announced that we would do no-cost extensions for those grantees and that they would be awarded continuation grants. That happened in 2019. And then in July 1 of 2020, the fund transitioned from Associated Black Charities to the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund, Inc., which is a 501c3 that administers the Children and Youth Fund. We announced through our board in June of this year, 2021, that we were going to deploy $5.5 million in direct grants to support grassroots infrastructure and grassroots organizations through aligned grant making. And we're anticipating that in spring of 2022, we will do an open call for grants. So phase 3 is really about where are we going next, starting in July of 2021, next month. We have a few categories that we function in, and that's community engagement, programming, operations, communication, and our leadership. Okay. Community engagement really works in will be working in 4 particular areas: our board of directors, our public assembly, participation in grant making, and our partnerships. Our board of directors right now is a transition board. Their term expires at the end of December. We know that we're going to need a permanent board of directors. Typically in an institution, a decision about how that will work has already been decided. In BCYF, we'll need to design a process to select the future members of the board. We don't want it to look like what happens in a lot of organizations, which is you ask people you know, you ask friends. A lot of times it's a network, it's unspoken, it's not a transparent process, nor is it intergenerational. BCYF's board will be intergenerational. It will have members of community. There will be people on the board who may look like sort of what you perceive as traditional board members, and we will have members of city government also on our board. We don't believe in having tokenized board members, and it's not that I think any board intends to do that, it's something that happens. We're going to be very deliberate about not only how we do our onboarding, but also our education component, particularly around our youth members, so that they can be an active and engaged part of the board. What we don't want is anyone serving on the board who is uncomfortable or doesn't understand their fiduciary responsibility. Now, the task force also recommended a public assembly, serving as part of our institutional infrastructure. The public assembly would be engaged in working with our board, with community, with selection of grants, and we'll need to determine what should this look like? How does it tie into the board? Is it a pipeline? Is it something separate? What decisions do they hold versus decisions that are held in other places? What does the onboarding look like? This needs to be determined and implemented. As I mentioned before, we're talking about institutional formation, but also implementation. So a lot of times the things that we're doing, there's nothing that came before. So we're developing those policies, those processes, the thoughts and philosophies of how do we have a liberatory governing structure that looks different than what other institutions have. Now, many of you remember that we had a grant review panel back in 2018 that selected the first cohort, that first portfolio of grantees. Now we'll need to decide, what does this look like in the future? What does grant selection, participatory grant selection, community-based grant selection look like? Will it look like we did before? How will that tie into a public assembly or a board? What decisions will they make? How will we go through a selection and a vetting process like we did in year 1? There are lessons that we learned. How do we apply them? How does that tie into our overall grant making strategy? Again, these are areas that we need to think about and develop as we move forward in this next phase. And then finally, our partnerships. We've talked about being a community resource. We've worked with a lot of other organizations as is, and we need to be thinking about how do we think about our aligned grant making and our aligned partnerships in the future? How do we determine whether other entities are aligned in our values? And even for those that aren't, how do we work together in this ecosystem? How do we continue to support the profile of grantee that BCYF is really targeting to support. How do we really serve as a community resource without mission creep? We've already seen a desire and a tendency to make BCYF be all things to all people, and that's unrealistic. So how do we set our boundaries and our edges while also serving community? Then we have our programs, serving in grant making, portfolio management, and technical assistance. Grant making is what most people know. We talk about the ATM model, doling out funds, but really it's thinking about what is our grant making strategy? Are we the funder of first resort or last resort? Are we the place that grassroots organizations come because they haven't been funded in other places? Or because we have so many requirements, because we have taxpayer funds and there's 100% documentation and a whole lot of other requirements, do we partner with private organizations to move grantees along a trajectory and then we're at the end? How do we define sustainability? This is something that has come up in the past. What percentage of funding should BCYF be for a potential grantee? Who makes these decisions? How are they made, particularly when we're talking about public bodies or public participatory grant making being engaged in these decisions? Are we asking people who were on those panels to make those decisions, or are we giving them guidelines? If we're giving them guidelines, what are those guidelines? That's the type of information and the type of decision making that really is critical and shapes how we do our work. Then once we have grantees, we call this portfolio management. So right now, keep in mind, we have a portfolio of grantees. Many of them are closing out, but we're still going to have about 30 to 35 that have applied for a no-cost extension. So we're still working with them. We've also recently deployed or agreed to deploy $5.5 million. So we're going to have new grantees coming on. But one thing that we really want to take time to really delve into and to be intentional about is, what does the grantee relationship look like with BCYF? We know we don't want to be transactional. How do we really make this relational and be that community resource while battling that tension of being a quasi-public agency? And so a lot of our grantees have given us feedback about what worked, what didn't work. There were things we saw that worked, that didn't work. How do we begin to use those lessons learned to create a more meaningful grant cycle for organizations in the future, so they don't feel like they're just getting money and giving things back to us and getting TA, which is important to them, but really this becomes about how do we change how we engage with one another? What is it that we expect from one another? How do we have those conversations? And some of the more simple things, such as to be able to tell grantees at the beginning of a grant cycle, this is what the convening schedule is going to look like. These are the things that we're going to do and that you can expect. That's something we hadn't been able to do. And it seems small, but when you're an organization that your people may not be working full time and you want to take full advantage of what BCYF is offering, you want to know way in advance, okay, in this month, they're going to have sessions about financial policies. In this month, they're going to do work around human resources. And I want to have some other people from my team in there. And so they can plan. We want to be able to give to grantees before they ever apply, this is our grants manual. This is what you're going to be asked to do. And to be able to go into that in detail so that there aren't surprises along the way because we're still developing policy. BCYF has walked into having nothing and having to build from scratch. Many other funders, a lot of times people come into a job, they have something already handed them that says, this is how we do business. What BCYF is determining is, this is how we do business as BCYF Inc., while we still have a portfolio of grantees. And then finally, technical assistance. And this is something that we talk about a lot. It's something that we offered, and it's, it was not perfect, but it's something that we offer that a lot of other funders can't, simply because it's expensive. And it really is an investment that some folks don't have resources to be able to provide to their grantees. And so we have grantee TA and community TA. Our grantee technical assistance really was directed toward what individual grantees need. And we want to continue to do that. But we also want to have a suite of services that we provide where we have a standard and a curriculum, and we know that this is the BCYF way. that we know that what is being shared across grantees is consistent. And then what is our methodology for selecting, vetting, and evaluating providers? Because we're not just doing TA, we're doing TA that is equitable, that is respectful of our young people, that gives them agency, and helps them really lead and guide what's happening within those organizations. Similarly, we don't believe in just providing technical assistance to our grantees. Part of being a community resource is to be able to provide TA to organizations that are not BCYF grantees. Again, that's something that is a challenge for others because it requires deep resources. And so we want to be able to establish what are the regular annual TA offerings that BCYF is going to provide. So for example, one of our grantees is on, and we had talked about this particular training repeatedly, something like first aid and stop the bleed. You are working with young people. There are certain things that everybody should have training on that is just fundamental to providing basic services to young people. And so those are things that BCYF should be able to offer several times a year and repeatedly, and for the community to know that this is what we're going to do, and to also have a process for how we'll determine what's emergent, how we meet emergent needs, and how we work with other funders to provide, again, consistent TA that is reflective of our values, that is reflective of our community. What is it that BCYF is going to lead? What are we going to fund? What are we going to do pooled funding on? How do we do that? And then what are our policies and our SOPs that need to be in place? So as you can see, just in those categories, this is a massive undertaking that we're doing. There's often an expectation that everything is fully baked, and then there's frustration when things don't look the way people think that they should. We also have that same frustration because we want time to do these things and to do them well in order to provide excellence in service to our organizations that are providing excellence in service to young people. We've been really proud that we've been able to do TA around fiscal sponsorship earlier this year, and to provide that to community. We're right now doing a series of youth development series in partnership with Maryland Mentor and SRG. We know that more than 50% of the almost 500 applications that we received in year one had some mentoring component. Loving youth and wanting to serve youth is great, but that's not enough. And we want to be sure that our community-based TA offerings are helping folks provide the best services that they can to our young folks. Then we move into operations, and this is where we really start to get into the institution building piece of BCYF Inc. We're doing the same things that many of our grantees are doing, which is building our base. We're building that infrastructure. And so we start with finance. And so we're already managing finance. We have fiscal controls policies that were in place on day one. We do quarterly reporting to the city. There's been questions about what is BCYF doing with all the money? Well, all the money actually sits at the city, and BCYF does a drawdown each quarter, and we document what we spent in the prior quarter. So funds, the majority of them sit with the city, and then we pull down as we spend. Our budgetary planning, we're going to talk tonight about our budget, monthly reconciliations, we have our accounts payable and receivable, all the ordinary things that finance department would ordinarily do. Right now, we outsource some of these. We'll need to make a decision about whether we'll ultimately bring these in-house. Also, how do we think about finance, BCYF finance, but also how we work with our grantees? In the past, we've done multiple disbursements to them as part of the grant cycle. Well, if you only have a $5,000 grant, maybe you don't necessarily want to have 2 payments come to you. Those are decisions the finance team will need to think about. How do we help our grantees install fiscal controls and other processes that they may not know that they need? What staffing structure do we use to help grantees get through expense reports? This is something that our grantees know about firsthand. What we've asked them for is over and above what almost anyone else is asking them for. How do we provide that support so that they not only can learn, but meet the compliance requirement? Our focus has been on compliance and jumping over those hurdles. We really want to move toward, whether you're looking at a BCYF grant a publicly funded grant or even a private grant, there are certain things you want to have in place and being able to spend that time with those grantees. And then finally, how do we train and support our board members to understand and execute their fiduciary responsibilities? Then we go into HR. And one way for people to think about it is, if you have a day job, and typically when you start, there's been a hiring letter, you may have gone through a process where an HR person was in charge, you were offered an employee handbook and told these are our policies, and you were told these are our benefits, and then how to sign up, and maybe there was a portal or, this is our point of contact. Imagine walking into your first day of work and finding nothing there. There's just a desk. That's what we have had, is basically just a desk. And it's our role right now as part of startup to create that handbook, all of those policies. What are the benefits going to be for our employees that reflect our values? Who are those vendors going to be? What does performance feedback look like? How do we onboard, orient, exit, offboard, professional development? All these decisions need to be made in addition to sourcing talent and finalizing a pay structure that is equitable, that is responsible, that is reflective of our values and our city requirements, and that follows local hiring law. That's a tall, tall order just to get started. And we have our data and information technology. It really starts with the bigger question of what information does BCYF want to capture and for what purpose? We're often asked for an impact report. What people I think are really asking us for is outcomes, which is, what are your grantees doing? What BCYF wants to get to is really process, outcomes, and impact. Process is, what are we doing? How are we doing it? Why are we doing it? Does it reflect our values? Is it leading to what we say we want for BCYF? And then our outcomes, which is, what does our portfolio of grantees do? What is it that they're able to produce? How is it that they're able to impact young people? And then impact, which is much greater. It is our theory of change for BCYF. It is what happens within generations and across generations. And what is it that we want to measure? What is it that we want to do? How are we going to evaluate each of those three? That we are walking our talk, that we are responsible stewards of money, that what we're doing is actually creating that systemic change. And then how do we manage that data? How do we share it? How do we present it? How do we work even just internally? Many of you, again, if you have a day job, or you work for someone else, you go in and there's an IT person that says you get access to this, you get access to that, you don't have access to this, you can read this, you can edit that. Again, BCYF walked into nothing. We're having to make those decisions on our own. And we need to be responsive to being subject to Maryland Public Information Act. So not only capturing our data, but then also how do we push it back out? We're also creating a grants management system. This is something that our grantees experienced firsthand in year one, having a system that was really developed for receiving proposals and reading and scoring proposals, but not necessarily for those grantees that were funded to then be able to use to access their reports, to submit, to ask questions, to share their pictures and their videos. They weren't able to upload many things. You could only have one person who was a point of contact. So if that person left, you were locked out. We're making those changes and building a system that really sets us up for success in the long term, that's tied to that data in IT and also our vendor management in a way that makes sense. And then also helping our grantees think about even their own data as well. And then we have our grants and contracts management. So we need to think about our contracting process as we are bringing on new vendors and we'll be sending out new RFPs. How do we evaluate what comes in? What's important to us? So typically in an RFP, you're asked, please submit a proposal that is responsive to the organization's needs. Well, we're looking at more than that. We want to know a little bit more about your organization. We want to know how you implement equity and inclusion throughout everything that you do. And how is that reflected in how you operate? How is that reflected in who works for your organization? And questions similar to that. And we need to think about then, how do we evaluate when RFPs come in, not on a, oh, you just had the lowest bid, and so that's who we hire, but really balancing that with our values and what services can be provided. We're also working with our grantees, obviously, around grant agreements, about extensions, about compliance, thinking about what does that look like? How do we meet the needs of small organizations, small grassroots teams that may have a budget of 50,000 versus a budget of 5 million? Does their grant agreement look different? Does the contracting process look different for a sole proprietor versus a large firm that has dozens of employees? And really just, what is BCYF's internal processes for reviewing and evaluating these things to ensure that, again, we are living our values. And then finally, evaluation and learning. And this is something that a lot of times organizations skimp on. Again, I talked earlier about process, outcome, and impact. This is actually related to everything that BCYF does. What does success look like for a BCYF grantee? What does success look like for BCYF as an institution? What does it look like for vendors that we work with? What does it look like for partners that we work with? And so we're developing frameworks and tools for each of these areas. How do we, again, collect data, to share data, to spread to stakeholders? How do we do it in a way that people understand so that it's easy to access and understand what we're sharing? And then again, even helping our grantees consider how they think about their own data. So when they're doing their metrics and their reporting, they're counting. This is what we often do, is count. What is it that we're collecting? What is it that the organization is trying to do? We don't just want to measure the number of youth served. That's important, but we also want our grantees to think about the impact of their program. How does it tie into what we may be trying to move as a city? And so next we have communications. Again, a lot happening in each of these categories. There's the big picture communications of what is that BCYF wants to do? And this is part of why we're having tonight's session, is to be able to share, this is what BCYF is about, but really also to broadly communicate that BCYF believes in 4 things: that community-based organizations need an ecosystem, infrastructure, and investment to support their work, that methodologies that emerge from community-based organizations are as effective as those handed down by big box nonprofits. A lot of times there's assumption that because you're small, you're not mighty, or you don't know what you're doing. And that's not true. And so we want to be able to lift up those methodologies that oftentimes have been ignored, sometimes because of who's presented it or how it's been presented. We also believe that Black and community-based leadership of these major industries enhances the effectiveness of the industries. Those who are most proximate to the youth, who reflect the youth that they serve, that impacts their effectiveness. And so a lot of times we have organizations that will, we call it parachuting in. You parachute into a neighborhood. You don't live there, you're not of it, there's no connection with the people there other than that program. And so what we're doing is looking at, no, you know what? This is about community-based leadership and developing that leadership and supporting that leadership. And then knowledge that emerges from organizations and groups that belong to or proximate to the community produce more impactful inventions and solutions. This is what BCYF is about. This is what we want to continue to help people understand. So as we say, we're not an ATM, we're not an ATM. Those 4 things is what we're really about, and how we invest and what drives our investments. We also know that we talk to a variety of audiences, and that each of those audiences has a proximity to power. And we want to be able to name that, address that, and to be able to speak to those audiences specifically. With our grantees, we want to amplify their voices. A lot of times grantees really haven't had their own social media, their own marketing campaigns. And so BCYF really is about lifting up, this is what our grantees are doing, and helping them and their youth tell their own story, that it's not someone else coming in and saying, this is what's happening, but people saying, this is what's happening to me. Also being able to support grantees in promoting their events. With that comes responsibility. What are our policies around that? What are our practices? What do we retweet, for example, and what do we not retweet? And then we have our own internal communications that we need to work on. Many of you, if you've worked in a large organization, you know that the larger your organization gets, the harder it is for information to flow throughout and for it to be accurate information. And so just thinking about, things like platforms. Some people are on Slack, some people are on some type of channel like that, some just use email. What is it that we're going to do? And then training people to actually use it. How do we share materials with board members? We're going to have this brand new board that comes on. How do board members talk to one another? How do they talk to staff? How do they talk to grantees? And then finally, I included this slide because a lot of times people think these things happen in the vacuum. In reality, it's that they don't. There's a leadership team. And so there's a team that works on strategy. What are we doing in the next 6 months? What are we doing in the next 6 to 12 months? What are team decisions versus board decisions? How do we move people and make sure the work is really thinking about what BCYF again is about, and that everything we do leads back to that. What do we want to be, do, and look like, and how do we get there? Right now, we have a team that we know a lot of us, we're going to move on. We are consultants, but we want to have something that stands, that we're proud of, and that most importantly reflects those task force recommendations that were approved by City Council and that our voters said, this is what we want. And then we have management. That's the day-to-day work to get everything together. We're always going to have competing demands. We're trying to build an institution and we're trying to manage a portfolio of grantees. We want to be responsive to the city. We want to be responsive to community. You often hear the phrase, building the plane while flying the plane while building it. We are manufacturing the parts and building the plane and flying it at one time. How do we hold each other accountable for the urgency of the work, but also that it meets our mission and our values? It is easy to move full steam ahead in response to we have to do, but we want it to be a thoughtful doing. First, it's who are we being and how are we being, and then what do we do? Every organization has risk. How do we manage our risk? What are our legal requirements as a quasi-public organization subject to a number of city requirements in managing public funds? So thinking about, again, that tension between the two of community resource within a system and a structure that wasn't necessarily built for systems change. How do we do this? How do we do it responsibly? What systems do we create to make sure that we're in compliance, but that BCYF can also be what voters said they wanted, what council has mandated that we do, that our task force has recommended, and that we have all agreed that we want to be a part of. And then there's the connecting of the dots. I shared a whole lot in this presentation. It is easy to work in silos in each of those buckets and categories. What's critical is that the left hand always know what the right hand is doing, and that we're all working together to make sure that we're achieving, again, that mission, that vision, and that impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara. So much that we've done and so much that there is to continue to do. So thank you for that overview. We will now have our budget discussion about the activities and the vision for FY22. Mr. John Morris and Chuck Atkins will lead us in that conversation. Okay, there you go. Mr. John.
Okay, one second, make sure I am, yes, I am muted. I think we presented a budget at our last public board meeting. Mr. Atkins, are you available?
I am, Mr. John.
Is it possible you could review for us basically the budget that was presented last time?
Absolutely. I can share my screen and go over the budget.
Please.
Okay. Is my screen showing?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. So in front of us on the screen is the budget for Baltimore Children and Youth Fund, Inc. from the period of July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. And this budget is 12 months, and it is projecting $17.5 million of revenue coming from Baltimore City Youth Fund. And that revenue is being spent in 3 buckets, and that's column D, column C, and column B. Column D is the grant making and technical assistance. Column C is public engagement, and column B is the administration. So if we go down through the budget, I'll work down through the expenditures that make up the $17.5 million, and I'll reference those 3 columns as I do so. So as we move down through the budget, the first area that we come to are the salaries and fringe benefits and professional fees. So that column makes up $4.6 million. And that column is allocated to be 1.9 million inside of grant making and technical assistance, 610,000 inside of public engagement, and 2.1 million in administration. The next line item is the stipends for youth and grant review panel. That is $125,000, which is aligned under the public engagement column. Advertising and promotional expenses are estimated to be $53,000. 50 of that is inside of public engagement, and 3,500 is inside of administration. Bank and payroll fees are $4,000. That will be under the administration column. Corporate insurance, $20,000 is estimated for the year, and that is under administration. Grants are $12 million, and that obviously comes under the grant making and technical assistance column. We have meals and catering at $12,500. 5,000 of that is in grant making, 5,000 in public engagement, and 2,500 in administration. Membership dues are estimated to be $17,000, and that falls under administration. Printing and copying is $2,000, with 1,500 being in grant making and technical assistance, 500 in administration. Rent estimated to be $55,000 under administration. Staff professional development, $5,000 under administration. The supply area, we've broken down into some subcategories, so I'll go through those. $85,500 for technology supplies. That is $45,500 under grant making and technical assistance, $20,000 under public engagement, and $20,000 under administration. We come down to computers, laptops, printers, $15,000 for under the administration column. The next 2 lines actually should be kind of looked at together. That is the estimation for furniture and the depreciation of that furniture. So you can see about $20,000. $20,000 has been budgeted, and that falls under administration. Other supplies is $17,500 with $5,000 under grant making and TA, $7,500 under public engagement, and $5,000 under admin. Telecommunications is estimated to be $2,500 under administration. Travel is estimated to be $1,500 under administration. And operational support fees are estimated to be $407,000, which falls across $161,000 in grant making and technical assistance, $61,000 under public engagement, and $184,004 under administration. And that brings us down to the total expenditures, which matches the revenue of $17,517,060, which is split across those 3 columns. And row 44 indicates the percentage breakdown of those expenditures between those 3 columns, with the target down below in row 45. I can turn it back over to you, Mr. John.
Okay. That annual budget reflects a number of activities, which would include our hiring of an executive director and the beginning of the hiring of staff. And it reflects the beginning of our aligned grant-making strategy, which you heard a description of in the earlier portion of the presentation. As you can see with the budget, the ordinance's prescribed ratios are maintained throughout, so that there is 15%, less than 15% allocated for administration. There's 5% allocated for community engagement, and the percent for grant making is, I believe it's more than 80%. That's the budget. I think you've heard what our proposed set of activities are for the year. I basically conclude my presentation on the budget, and perhaps we can begin addressing any questions that people have in the questions.
Thank you so much, John and Chuck. And yes, we are going to now open things up for questions. I'd like to ask Adam to just come back on and reiterate the way in which you would like folks to engage in the Q&A, either through the chat or on voice.
Thank you very much. Okay, appreciate the conversation tonight. And for people who are watching, there's a couple things, just a reminder. I see a few folks have already put questions in the Q&A box, but just a reminder. So there's a couple ways that you can engage tonight. So if you want to, if you would like to speak or make your comments vocal, if you notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a raise hand function. So you can click that button. And when I see the list of folks who are attending tonight, I can actually make it so that you can speak to members of the board, and you can give a 3-minute testimony and feedback on tonight's proceedings. And so you can do it that way. You can also type your question out in the Q&A function. So if you look at your screen at the bottom, you see Q&A, you tap that button and you type in your question, and we'll see it in the box. So since I don't see anyone's hand raised right now, I'm going to go to the Q&A. I'm sorry. Yep.
I'm sorry, I apologize for interrupting you. I missed one thing on the agenda. And so I did want to pause you for one moment and ask Ms. Catherine if she would provide closing comments for BCYF, and then we'll introduce the public questions. My apologies, Ms. Catherine.
It's okay, sweetie. It's been a busy night. A lot of information has been shared. We thank you for the overview of our activities for FY2022 and the budget to support those activities. Now, the purpose of this meeting, as Adam said, is to hear from you about your plan and the budget to support the plans. Now, keep in mind that those that presented to you, that Erica and Julia, they talked about the purpose of the case for BCYF. Also, John and Kirsten, they talked about what does it mean to be a community resource, and you could address questions on these. Also, we had a full understanding and overview from Kira on the plans of FY22. And of course, we appreciate Chuck's information on the budget. This is a very important part of the meeting. We really look forward to hearing from you this evening and our continued public engagement. As Adam expressed, each speaker will have 3 minutes. And those that do not get to speak, we will be monitoring the chat. Dion, we thank you for sharing such a gorgeous meeting tonight.
Thank you so much, Ms. Catherine. All right, Adam, back to you to begin the Q&A process. And we do have 3 questions already in the chat.
Yep. All right. And just to make sure to reiterate, if you don't want to type your question, you want to speak, you just click raise hand and you'll be able to speak tonight. So I'm going to read the first question that came in towards the beginning of the discussion. It's from Christy Green. The question reads, hello there, good evening. To be clear, there will not be 2020 grant, to be clear, there will not be 2021 opportunities for nonprofits like ours who are providing direct service to youth and their families to apply for BCYF funding. Coming out of the pandemic, direct youth support is even more critical and necessary. Thank you for clarifying. So the question is about grant making for 2021, grant opportunities for 2021, what is available, and if there's nothing available for in terms of a traditional grant, what is available in terms of support for local organizations. Anybody want to take that question?
So I can answer. So BCYF's aligned grant making strategy actually is funding the Baltimore Summer Funding Collaborative. There will be opportunities for organizations to apply for BCYF money through the Summer Funding Collaborative in the fall. BCYF is also supporting B-City through the Department of Health. There will be opportunities for subgranting there as well. What BCYF will not be doing in 2021 is something that looks similar to what happened in 2018. We actually will not be doing an open call for applications until spring of 2022. And it will likely not look exactly like what we did in 2018. It will likely look different. So while we understand that, yes, it is critical that we invest in organizations that serve youth, our direct investments are what I just described. What we will be doing is to continue to provide significant technical assistance to organizations that are serving young people while we are building up the infrastructure of BCYF. One of the things that's important is if the infrastructure of BCYF isn't strong, we will never be a strong foundation. We will never be able to provide the level of service that we want to long-term. And so in this calendar year, funding will look as I just described.
All right, thank you, Kira. So we have a second question from an anonymous attendee. It reads, appreciate the thoroughness, but they feel with the high quality staff and interim board, I am confused. It doesn't seem necessary that BCYF needs to start from scratch. This seems to be what is being said. It seems that what was accomplished, this 2-year pilot, was successful. So BCYF is starting over. While BCYF is unique, there was also a discussion of initially looking at other similar city funds for best practices. And there's also a second question in there that says, what is the status of hiring an executive director? So the question really centers around, is BCYF starting over from the 2-year, the pilot that was done from the first year, and also asking a question about why is BCYF being built the way it is? Is it necessary that it is built from scratch altogether? And also the question about the status of hiring an executive director.
Well, thank you, anonymous attendee, for asking your question. I will attempt to answer and also welcome other board members to chime in. So yes, BCYF absolutely learned a lot from what we've accomplished so far. And we have an amazing group of board members as well as consultants and our transition manager who also has been a part of this process and have some lessons learned, but also their own experience that they're able to share that informs the way in which we are doing our work. But we are starting honestly from scratch. We just became our own entity in July, and we are approaching actually our 1-year anniversary. So we're literally building a new organization from scratch. Yes, we have resources, we have individuals, we have tools to build off of, but we still have to customize those things specific to BCYF. In addition to that, we are trying to shift the way in which things have been done in the past. We don't want to repeat what other folks have done because oftentimes many folks, particularly Black and Brown folks, have been left out of the traditional process. And so our goal really is to create an organization that is more welcoming, that's more diverse, and that really creates increased level of opportunities for organizations that are often overserved or overlooked. And so that is requiring us, Kara had in addition to the saying about flying the plane while building it, she said we're basically building the parts as well. And that's so true, because we really are trying to do things a bit different. In a way, we're trying to decolonize the way in which work has been done historically in philanthropy and in supporting nonprofit organizations as a whole. So I hope that answers your question. And I think in the long run, it will benefit all of us, definitely the city of Baltimore, and even more importantly, the young people that we're trying to serve by doing things a bit differently than they've been done in the past.
What I would add to that is the fact that we're doing this with public resources. And so in balancing out all of the approach that Deon just talked about, it's also understanding that we are working within the apparatus of public support. And so our accountability is also to the structure, to the city of Baltimore, as well as residents, tax-paying residents, youth. So how do we, again, craft an organization that takes all of this into account and ensures that what moves forward beyond any of us being here can sustain itself over time with those original principles intact. And so just again, being very intentional and thoughtful about what does it look like to build an organization that quite frankly doesn't exist in the ecosystem right now. And so yes, it is a startup, and it is a startup that is trying to do something very different.
I would also add in, I guess, thinking about the question that the participant asked, which I think was a thoughtful one. Mm-hmm. I think it's useful to ask a question as to whether we're satisfied that our city is doing a good job supporting its young people, particularly those young people of color. I think that BCYF exists is a reflection of a general sense that we're not. So if we start with that dissatisfaction, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to say what's missing is more of what we've been doing that hasn't been working to our satisfaction. So necessarily, we are looking to invent a new way of doing what we've been trying to do all along that hasn't worked as well as we'd like. So I don't know that necessarily means we're starting over. What it means is we're looking critically all the time at how we're going about doing things with a particular eye towards changing the outcomes that have been so seemingly persistent. And I think if we were a for-profit entity, we would be praising an organization like BCYF, looking at itself anew every day as a paragon of innovation. So we are basically trying to establish ourselves as a social engine of innovation, so that we are going to the sources of grassroots community action and elevating those innovative efforts that communities are undertaking to uplift their own children, scaling them so that as a city, we can apply those strategies and those lessons learned across the board, so that we don't just get a good outcome, one family, one neighborhood, one program at a time, but across the entire city.
Thank you, John. And Kara, if you could just take a moment to reiterate the staff selection plan and timeline around that. That was one question, another part of the question.
Certainly. So the first hire that BCYF wanted to bring in is a president and CEO. We're in the process of identifying a search firm. Job description is mostly drafted, and we are subject to local hiring laws, so it will not be a surprise. This will be rolled out. It will be pushed out to the, we'll make it clear to the distribution list. You will know that BCYF is hiring for this role, and our target is actually next month, July. When we go back to what we talked about before, when you hire someone, you need to have benefits. You need to have made a decision about what is your policy around benefits. There should be a handbook in place and a number of employment policies as well. This is what it means to work here. So that's work that we've been doing this year, which has led to, okay, now we're at a place where we can hire, and also thinking about what does our hiring process look like so that we don't get the kind of candidate that typically shows up when a search is done, but that we have actually a diverse candidate pool that reflects BCYF values with people who understand what we're trying to do, and that we're not just hiring generically. So again, that's targeted search to be launched next month. We are also hiring out the rest of the leadership team. Those would be the vice presidents. And so drafting those job descriptions now, and they will be coming right behind president and CEO. So again, having that be pushed out through local hiring law, again, by the end of July is the target.
Thank you, Kara. And thank you to the anonymous attendee for your questions. Adam.
All right, so we have another question I've seen in the Q&A box. I don't see any other questions, and I haven't seen any hands raised. Just a reminder, if you want to speak, just hit the raise hand function in the bottom of the window so you can speak tonight. Also, we're going to give a little bit of time after I read this question for folks to still put questions in the box. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get their perspectives and feedback heard tonight. So we have a question from Tara Huffman. The question is, given the startup-ism of the org and all the building that needs to be done in operations of staff, why is so little allocated to staff development? Does BCYF anticipate not having an even small staff complement in fiscal year 2021?
I think this is actually great feedback. So we did not have a large staff development budget this year because we knew we weren't really going to have staff, and consultants are responsible for paying for their own staff development. As we've made the decision to bring on the leadership teams really in this calendar year, we will have probably four employees and may need more than the $5,000. Now, truthfully, we don't have a staff development plan, nor do we have a staff development philosophy. Those are things that need to be developed. But I like the question because even though we may not have done those things, I think it's great feedback that we go back and increase that budget to ensure that those who are coming in, particularly in the front door, the first ones in as staffers, that they have the professional development that they need in order to succeed. So again, appreciate all those questions, appreciate that feedback, and would make that recommendation.
All right, so we don't have any questions in the Q&A box right now. I haven't seen any hands raised. So we're gonna give a couple minutes for folks to, to percolate their thoughts and to give feedback if they have any, or to ask any questions. But while we're waiting on that, there's actually one comment here in the from Kathleen McCarthy to the board that says, I just want to offer my sincere thanks and appreciation to all the presenters and everyone involved in breathing life into this daunting and audacious ballot initiative. This is hard work with the potential for many pitfalls, and I applaud and appreciate you all for being so intentional and unwavering in your work. That's from Kathleen. Appreciate you, Kathleen, for the feedback tonight. And also, while people are watching, if you have not already attended or seen some of the announcements that we've sent out more recently about the Youth Development Series, we highly encourage you to forward it to your networks. It's been a form of community-based technical assistance that we've been doing over the past 3 months. I think 2 or 3 months at this point. I'm losing track of the months at this point. But if you have anybody in your networks who will find it useful, because we're talking about what does it mean to engage in youth development, and we're dealing with some very foundational questions around how to work with young people, youth and young adults, and it's designed for people who are running organizations right now that work with young people. And so if you have folks in your networks that you will find it useful, just go to the website, BCYF.org, and you can find all the information about these upcoming events. We've also uploaded the last two that we've done. We had a third one that was done yesterday. It's going to be uploaded to our YouTube page. So if you have folks that have missed it, if you haven't seen it already, highly encourage you to go over to our YouTube page and check out the previous events. They've been chock full of good information for folks. And it's in the range of experiences, folks who are just beginning to start in the nonprofit sector, working with young people, all the way up to folks who have several years of experience. So we highly encourage folks to attend and be a part of those conversations if necessary, if you're interested. All right, so seeing none, I don't see any questions. So I will throw it back to you, Dion, and I guess we can close out this evening's hearing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you to everyone in the public for your questions and even just for being here tonight. I know that you could be home, you could be watching your favorite TV show or eating your favorite dinner. So thank you so much for your time and your feedback. Again, just want to remind you, if you think of a question or if you have a comment that you'd like to send privately, you can email us at info@bcyfund.org, and we are happy to respond to any of your questions or inquiries. Also, if you check out our website, all of our board meetings scheduled dates are on the website. And feel free to join us for those meetings. The best part of those meetings, beyond us telling you what's going on with BCYF, is the fact that we now do grantee spotlights. So you get an opportunity to hear about some of the amazing work that's happening in Baltimore City that's serving and supporting our young people. A lot of really great things are happening. And so just encourage you to take some time to be with us in that way as well. I think I lost my agenda somewhere, but I think that concludes everything that we have planned for this evening. Again, thank you to all the public. Thank you to our board members. Really appreciate your time and your service. Thank you to our transition leader and our communications leader, and also to those who you guys don't see on the screen who are doing a tremendous amount of work as TA providers and consultants to this amazing organization. So thank you guys again. Enjoy the beautiful summer. It's still light outside, so if you can get out and get some fresh air, do so. And we look forward to seeing you guys again in the future. Have a good night.